I've got my colleague in the background here monitoring the chat and the Q&A though, so hopefully any minor things should be addressed during the webinar. My name's Sarah Shuttleworth. I work for Plant Life, and in particular, I run the National Plant Monitoring Scheme. So today we're here specifically to talk about grasses, sedges, and rushes and seeing a difference. So if everyone's ready, we will commence. So as I said, we're learning about grasses, sedges, and rushes. That's why we're here today. So we're going to look at how and how to see the differences between these three groups. And then we're going to look at an example of each group that would be common in certain habitats. So if you were to go into any particular habitat, what three common grass or sedge or rush might you find in that habitat? But one of the first things that's worth talking about is why? Why should we learn about these? Why should we learn to tell the difference between these groups? But if you think about it, in order to start to understand grasses, sedges, or rushes individually as a group, you actually need to know what separates them, which is which, before you can actually learn each group individually. Being able to tell when you're looking at one and not the other, for example. Also, you'll notice maybe if you've got a habitat book that they're obviously they're in different sections. You've got grasses in one section, sedges in another section, and rushes in another. So it's useful sometimes if you're going out to a habitat to know when you're holding this thing that looks sort of grass-like, what part of the book to even start looking at really. Why are they so important? Well, they're great indicators of habitat condition. They can tell you whether the management on that site is successful or maybe it needs changing and it's not quite working out. Most of us are probably aware that plants in general form the basis of a habitat. They form the structure. They provide food and shelter for many of the organisms that live within it. And the base for most of these habitats, in terms of what plants are there, can be formed of these regenerative leafy growth that we know as grasses, sedges, and rushes. So in particular, for example, if we think about one particular habitat type that usually has all three of these groups, grasslands, you know, they can be really, really important grasslands and sometimes a little bit sort of not noticed as how important they can be. We might refer to them maybe as meadows or pastures or just the fields out the back. Maybe it's our own gardens and lawns. Maybe it's the downs, or maybe if you're based in Cornwall, you're referring to them as the culm grasslands. In general, these grasses, sedges, and rushes that could form up this part of this habitat are some of the most diverse group of plants that we have and are found in virtually all habitats, and not just grasslands. They can be found in woodlands, in wetlands, heathlands and moors, dunes, shingles, cliffs, and bogs, for example. Now, the success of all these groups is probably that their leaves grow continually from the base. So it doesn't really matter if they're grazed off or cut or mown, they will simply regenerate fresh tissue. If we think about grasslands again in particular, they can actually be so important when it comes to storing carbon. And actual recent studies have found that they could be better, in fact, than forests at storing carbon. So it's really important that we protect them. And across the globe, it covers 20 to 40% of the Earth's surface. Maybe that's not necessarily everyone's pastures and meadows, but savannas, steppe, prairie, or even pampas. So we're going to cover grasslands in a couple of the habitat types, but it is worth remembering just how important they are. So before we start looking at all of the differences they have between them, let's look at some of the commonalities. When we look at the landscape in front of us, we can sometimes assume that everything that's within our vision that creates a sort of flat green expanse must all be grass of some sort, and maybe there's a few wildflowers or weeds, however you want to phrase it, thrown in. But actually, not every plant that has a narrow strap-like leaf is a member of the grass family. But they do have a range of features that links them, and that's why they're often lumped together, especially if you go to a garden centre or something. You know, all your grasses and your sedges and your rushes will be in one part of the centre. but that's because of their fact that they have this similar appearance. And as a whole, they're collectively known as graminoids, which might be a term you've heard and it might not be. But basically, this describes a plant with a grass-like appearance. What are all of them, basically? Well, they're all monocots or monocotyledons, you might have heard, and monocots is sometimes used to abbreviate it. You might have also heard the phrase dicotyledons. So what are monocots? Basically, it means that the seedlings, when they're first growing out from their seed, have only one leaflet. Best way to imagine this is if you've scattered over, like many of us have done, some cress seeds on some cotton wool on your windowsill or something, you'll notice that as they sprout up, they come up and they have these two basic little leaves that don't necessarily look like the adult leaves will look, but they've got those two little leaves. So that would be a dicotyledon because it's got two seedling leaves. Whereas all of these ones, the grasses, the sedges and rushes, are monocotyledons, which means they only have the one little seedling leaf coming up. For anyone who's sown sweet corn might have noticed the same thing. So essentially, that is what a monocot is. But they also tend to have, when their leaves are mature, the mature leaves, they're usually narrow, unstalked, often parallel veined as well. So having all the lines of the veins together like that. Their narrow leaves all grow from their base rather than their tips. Again, this is enabling them to keep growing despite being grazed or cut. They all have flowers, believe it or not. Now, a lot of people, especially some of my friends who perhaps aren't as into plants as I am, are quite surprised when I tell them about the beautiful flowers that this grass or this sedge or this rush have, but they do all have flowers. Generally speaking, when we're talking about the flowers, we refer to it as the inflorescence. So that whole grouping of flowers is called the inflorescence, and that is the same across all three of the groups. That can then be broken down into individual parts of the inflorescence, and we could be talking about spikelets. And then they also all have leaves as well. So these are things they all have in common. Most of these plants are actually wind pollinated, which is why their flowers lack those sort of showy petals to attract insects. And they're often more dull colored and bunched together in these spikes because they don't need to look beautiful necessarily because they're not attracting insects to come and pollinate them. They're just relying on the wind. So some of their adaptations might be dependent on that, for example. So if we spend a bit of time looking at grasses first, seeing as that's one that most people are probably quite familiar with. So a few of the general rules that we're going to expand in a little bit more detail. They have hollow stems, which incidentally in grasses are called culms. Bit of a funny word, that one, but that refers to the stem of the grass. They then have these intervals or sections, and in between them, they have a little sort of part of that section called the node or the knee. Their leaves sheathe around the base of the stem. The grass flowers are arranged in sort of different spikelets within they're sort of within these spikelets made up of one or more florets. I'll get into more detail on the next slide for that. And these are all then grouped into different types of arrangements. So we've got panicles or racemes or something like that. And generally, the male and the female flowers are usually all together. So if we look at a little bit more detail about that, of what I was describing. So we have the culm, which is the stem of the grass. We then have the little intersections or the nodes or the knees, which is rather affectionately termed sometimes. We then have the inflorescence, which then breaks down into the smaller segments, which are called spikelets, and that describes the entire flowering unit. Now, for anyone that attended the Classes for Grasses webinar or would like to watch it again on YouTube now that it's up there, I go into far more detail about some of these individual anatomy parts of the grasses. But just to cover this basic part, I'll just explain that the spikelet is this whole unit here, and then we have the glooms down here, and then the individual florets. Now you could have one floret or you could have more than one floret, but that is the whole unit, the flowering unit. And generally speaking, we have the hollow stems as well. Taking a bit of time to click on, apologies for that. So then we have the idea that they have these variable inflorescence or the variable arrangement. So here we've got a species called meadow foxtail. You can see it's probably describing the fact that it looks a bit like a fox's tail and it grows in a meadow. So that's got an easy common name to get to grips with. And you can see that's quite a distinctive type of flower. But also you can have one where it's coming out like this, like sweet vernal grass, which is quite similar. However, you can also get ones like this one, which is called fern grass, which is growing out all one-sided, a bit like a sort of tail of sorts. And then finally, one of the really common arrangements in grasses is this panicle, where it grows out a bit like a sort of tree with branching parts coming off. So there's a real variability in how that inflorescence looks. Again, we talked about the stem or the culm, and then these intersections or nodes. So these are quite distinctive. And then we have the spikelet, which this whole thing is the spikelet. And we've got the two florets here. And then we've got a long feature here called an awn, which can be also a diagnostic feature in grasses. So that's grasses for you at the moment. If we move on to look at sedges and what that involves, sedges are actually more ancient than grasses, appearing more than 160 million years ago. Generally, they're more tolerant of wet conditions, which goes along with that evolutionary history of the fact that our planet, as plants were developing, was generally wetter. However, they have adapted to grow in all sorts of dry environments as well. The basic structure of the flowering parts is much reduced. Only a small flap known as the glume, and there's just one, encloses a spikelet of flowers. In the largest sedge family, known as Carex, which many of you may have heard, for example, the spikelet consists of just a single male or a single female flower. In other words, a male spikelet is simply a glume and then 2 or 3 stamens. And a female spikelet is just a glume, an ovary, and 2 or 3 styles. But in other families, the spikelets may contain both the male and the female flowers. These flowers can be grouped all together or in separate parts. A male-only collection of flowers, like you might get up here, or a female-only collection of flowers, like you might have here. Or these can be less distinctly separate and all look very much the same. And whether a sedge has its flowers all looking the same, the male and the female together, or whether these are separate looking, like we were talking about here and then up here, can be a hugely diagnostic feature and take you to one different part of sedges entirely. The spikelets can sometimes be single, solitary sort of spike at the top, again, where the male and the female parts will all just look the same. Things like common spike crush and things like that. Or they could be grouped into these different heads or spikes moving along, whether they're different or the same. Another really important feature about sedges is basically the nutlet or the fruit, which is enclosed in a capsule in some of the species anyway, within Carex, called a utricle. Now, I wouldn't worry too much when you're learning how to identify sedges about the utricles and the glumes, because quite often they'll describe the coloration of the glumes and the utricle and whether it has a sort of, when it has the beak at the top, whether it's notched or whether it's not. But these features are looking at the really finer details. And I would say if you can go on some of the more leafy characteristics, the growth habit, and simply the habitat it's growing in, then that's going to be better to start with than getting into these tiny, tiny details, which sometimes, you know, it can be such a subjective and comparative idea anyway, when you're looking at the color of the glume compared to another species, for example. And that's when just getting out in the field and seeing these things more often will help. So I mentioned growth forms. So essentially, sedges can grow in tufts or even big tussocks, or they could be creeping and covering the ground in big areas. Generally, they're all quite slow growing, and they can be really good indicators of maybe infertile or waterlogged soil. And as a result of our changing agricultural systems, many of them are actually disappearing as fields are drained or fertility sort of increases through the addition of fertilizers. Generally, They're nearly all perennials as a whole. There might be the odd one or two that bucks the trend, but they're much longer growing, as I said, so they're mostly perennials. One of the most distinctive features about sedges, however, is that their stems are solid, so not hollow like we were talking about grasses, and usually triangular in cross section. I like to think of a Toblerone when I think about this. I'm pretty good Toblerone. We don't have the divots and the nice bits that you can break off and eat, obviously. But the fact that they're triangular in cross section, you can see this one here is pendulous sedge, which is an annoying one in our garden. It grows everywhere. But as you can see, I cut it in half and it's a nice sort of slightly squashed where I've cut it triangle. Also, the leaves are arranged spirally in 3 ranks, whereas grasses have alternate leaves forming 2 ranks. And basically in 3 ranks means that the leaves are sort of grown on 3 sides of those sides of the 3-sided stem in vertical rows. The sedge flowers are wind pollinated again, like all of these. So they're small, often brown or black, and sometimes, obviously, as we talked about, with the separate male and female flowers on the same plant or in separate parts of the spike clip. So then if we go into rushes, looking at as a general rule, again, flowers can either be at the top of the stem or apparently coming off at the side of the stem, which is actually an illusion because this top part that carries on going isn't the stem itself, but it's actually a bract or a leaf or sort of stem-like structure that carries on. Generally, rushes have flat, hairless leaves or cylindrical stem-like leaves. So it can be quite hard sometimes to tell whether you're sort of either looking at a stem part of the plant or whether you're looking at the actual leaves, because the leaves themselves can be quite round, quite cylindrical, and almost look exactly the same as stems. There's a separate group within rushes, which is called the wood rushes, and they always have flat leaves, which actually, rather than being hairless, have really, really obvious long white hairs. And we'll look at some examples of those as we go further on. Generally, rushes leaves tend to be clustered at the base rather than coming off at various points up the stem. And again, they are slow growing plants and generally found on wetter soils. 1 or 2 species are annuals, but the rest are perennials as well, a bit similar to sedges. So looking at the actual flower structure of rushes then, they actually have the simplest flower structure out of all of them, consisting of 2 rings. So we've got a ring here on the outside. Oh, sorry, I accidentally pressed the clicker. We've got a ring on the outside and we've got a ring on the inside of what are called tepals. Now, for anyone who hasn't heard the term tepal, it's a sort of hybrid word where there's no clear distinction between a sepal, which is when you think of something like a buttercup, you've got your bright yellow petals. Now, most people are quite familiar with the term petal and what that means. And then underneath the buttercup, you've usually got these sort of bract-like kind of papery, leafy type things that don't quite look like petals, don't look like leaves underneath, almost look like they're supporting the petals. And those are called the sepals. So when there's actually no difference between the petal and the sepal, they just group them all together and say, we're just going to call them tepals instead. So with rushes, they all look the same, so they're called tepals. And we've got an outer row of 3 tepals and an inner row of 3 tepals as well. Normally, this whole sort of unit is somewhat of a greenish or brown color, and again, not brightly colored because it doesn't need to be. Inside of here, that's where you'll find either 1 or 2 rings of the stamens, and then in the very center, you'll have 3 stigmas. So as with a lot of monocots, it tends to run in groups of 3, whereas dicots, generally, you'll find that things are grouped in 4s or 5s, but within monocots, it's usually groups of 3. The stems are round and usually solid. So you can see here, I've just cut through this and you can see there's a sort of solid center to it. It's not really like really hard, depending on the species, but generally it's what's called a sort of pith in the middle. There are some, however, that aren't solid all the way down and it's called interrupted pith. So we'll get to those species as we come to it, but generally they've got this central bit inside. So some of you may have be familiar with the I'm not even sure where this originated from, this rhyme, but it can be quite a useful one actually, that sedges have edges, rushes are round, and grasses are hollow straight down to the ground. It's useful because it's easy to remember. Sedges have edges. We're talking about those 3 edges making a triangular cross section. Grasses are hollow. We're generally talking about the fact that they are mostly hollow and they go straight down to the ground, and rushes are round. So there you go. That's an easy way of remembering it. But essentially, from a distance, grasses, sedges, and rushes could look exactly the same. It's only when you come up and you look at them in far more detail and examine some of the features, like the flowers, the stems, the leaves, the seed heads, that sort of thing, that you realize there are actually differences. So again, grasses are usually hollow with these nodes, these little knees along it. And they've got a leaf sheath, although sedges do too, and ligules, which again, sedges do too. But I would say grass identification relies more on ligules than the other two do. Ligule, for anyone who isn't aware, is a sort of little part of the grass that pokes up when you pull the leaf away from the main stem, and it can be very long, or it can be small, or it can even be formed of a ring of hairs. Again, I recommend that you watch my grass anatomy basic structure webinar or video on YouTube just to get familiar with that and see some examples. Sedges, again, we say they've got the 3 edges and the triangle cross section. Some of them can actually be really sharply three-edged to the point where it could probably cut you if you ran your hand down it. Same with the leaves sometimes. And whereas some of them are more bluntly so, and that's often something it describes in the book. Again, they've got their leaves in the spiral arrangement in the 3 ranks, and generally on the whole, you find them maybe where the habitat is slightly wetter. Rushes, they've got the round and solid stems, or with the interrupted pith, and the leaves are quite stem-like as well. The flowers are sort of more like nutty brown blobs, and generally speaking, the overall look of the plant is that they can be shiny or got that sort of evergreen feel to the leaves and the stems. And again, generally prefer wetter habitats. And then there's that subgroup, the wood rushes, which are just slightly different to the rest of them, but are quite distinctive in their own right. So as long as you remember they're part of the rush family, which is helpful because it's in the title, then you'll know that they're a rush as well. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to look at some of the common habitats. And when I say common in inverted commas, I don't mean necessarily habitats that aren't under threat. We're going to cover, for example, calcareous grassland, which I would never describe as common as muck habitat. You're not going to stumble across and find that all the time. But they're habitats that are generally quite well distributed across the UK. You might know of a nature reserve that is one of these type of things. And they're just the kind of habitat that you could easily find and access is the idea behind when I say common habitats. So we're going to look at different grasslands. We're going to look at heathland. We're going to look at woodland. We're going to look at the coastal habitats, and then sort of bogs and upland more like habitats. Then we're going to look at an example of a grass, a sedge, and a rush that you're quite likely to find in each of these habitats. Again, there's some variability on where you are located. However, I have tried to pick species that have got a good UK distribution. Also, some of the species could actually be found in multiple habitats, so I wouldn't necessarily say they're indicative of that particular habitat sometimes, whereas some of them actually are indicative. Generally, the more common a species is, the more habitats it can survive in. So it's probably a generalist rather than a specialist. And that's why sometimes species can do so well and be so common, because they're very adaptive and able to grow in multiple different situations. Whereas if you've got a specialist that can only survive in a certain type of habitat, then that's not going to be as common because it's dependent on where that habitat is, for example. So the first one we're going to look at is neutral grasslands. And I picked this to start with just because it's obviously going to have lots of grasses and sedges and things like that in it. And it is one that we can usually find and access quite easily. So we could be talking about meadows or grazed pastures, hay meadows, pastures. We could even be talking about playing fields in your village or your town. or even your own lawn quite often could have some of these species in. So I'm going to name some of the common species and just show you some images of the ones that we're not going to cover in detail. But the ones I'm going to focus on would be the ones that are incredibly sort of likely to come across. But these are all what I would say common species for these habitats. So within the grasses, we've got false oat grass. Now, this one we're not going to cover today, but I do cover it on my video, The Usual Suspects, which talks about it. Very common grass, very tall, oat-like, can be quite dominating and take over a whole grassland area. Sweet vernal grass, again, another really common one. I cover it in the other webinar and I talk about it on my other videos. Yorkshire fog, we're actually going to talk about next because that's going to be one of the ones that I discuss in a minute, which is there. And then meadow foxtail, which is this one, another really, really common one of any grassland type, really. So you might have that in your garden or in your field nearby. But these are all ones that you could expect to find in this kind of habitat. Regarding the sedges, we're going to talk about hairy sedge, glaucous sedge, and oval sedge on this session. So I wouldn't worry about, I'm not going to show you pictures of those because we're going to go into them in detail. However, out of the rushes, we're going to go into looking at soft rush and hard rush. So I'm just going to show you, this is field wood rush, which actually has another rather cute name called Good Friday grass, because it can sometimes pop up in your lawns around Good Friday. So that could be one to look out for next spring. And again, it's one of these wood rushes. So you can just see from this image here, these long sort of straggly white hairs that come off the plant, and particularly on the edges of the leaves. Again, we'll go into wood rushes in more detail, but this is an incredibly common one that could pop up anywhere. So if we look at the first one, we're going to look at a grass. This is Yorkshire fog. So this one's rather adorable little species actually, because it's quite pinkish. It's sort of so softly downy all over that it feels a bit like velvet or sort of moleskin. And it opens out into a nice big panicle, which is that sort of branched or tree-like structure. And it has these lovely striped pajamas. So basically, if you were to sort of move away some of the material and look at the base of the grass as it's coming out of the ground, it gets very pale as it comes down. It's very hairy, but then it has these pink stripes on the pale background, which look quite a lot like striped pajamas. So you might be able to tell that you've got Yorkshire fog even without this sort of inflorescence here. Remember, that's the name of the flowers. The other thing is it's quite similar to a species called creeping softgrass. It looks almost identical really, although creeping softgrass tends to be more a woodland based species, but it doesn't have the hairy knees like creeping softgrass does. So that's something to check out for. But this one, I would say you're almost certainly going to have it in your lawn. If you do know mow May next year, which I recommend you all do, then you'll see this one come up. And it's so called Yorkshire fog because it creates a kind of purplish haze across the ground where it's first coming out, and it's rather pretty. So now we're going to talk about a sedge that you might find in this habitat. And this is a really, really common species that you're quite likely to see in grasslands that are either wet or dry. And it can actually be probably the easiest sedge to get to grips with because of how hairy it is. So Carex hirta basically means hairy sedge. The leaves are hairy, particularly at the base where it kind of comes in and joins at the main stem, particularly down in the bottom of the plant. So sometimes, again, you might have to move the material away to look at it. But if you actually use a hand lens, which is just a little device that you can get nice and close up to some of these plant species, you can see that the fruits, these bits here, are actually really, really hairy. And it's pretty much the only species that would look like that under a hand lens. So as soon as you see all of these hairs, you know you have hairy sedge. It is a tufted species, but it doesn't grow into forming big tussocks or anything. It tends to form more individual tufts amongst the grassland sward. It can actually grow in woodlands too. So the hairs are always the best way to know that you've definitely got this species. So don't always just rely on the fact that you're in grassland. As soon as you see those hairs, you know you've got hairy sedge. And now for the rush species within this habitat type. Now, gone for soft rush here because it's probably the most common and obvious rush species that there is. And I say you can find it in neutral grassland, but pretty much any habitat you could find soft rush in. Woodlands, wetland habitats, upland, moorland, it could be there. It's just so common, but I've grouped it in this one because it was just easy to do so. So again, this one isn't going to be indicative of this habitat type, but you can find it anywhere. So do you remember we were saying about rushes, how the leaves can be quite stem-like? So believe it or not, this that I'm holding here is a leaf, and it very much looks like a stem. It's very round. Remember, rushes are round. And it's very shiny, soft rush, and quite bright green. And you can see just how much the light is shining off it under the hand lens here. When you open it up inside, it's got that central pith like we looked at before, all the way up without any gaps. It's quite easily squashed and flattened. You know, it's not really rigid. And its flowers, as we talked about, they're not brightly coloured or anything because it's wind pollinated, and they appear sort of as if they're coming out the side of the stem, but actually it's that bract that continues up. So actually they are at the top. They've just got that extra bit. It can spread out more than this. So this is how it could look maybe mid-season, and it could spread out more than that. But it generally will come onto a very similar species, compact rush, later, and I'll show you the differences. But this one, you could even have this one growing in parts of your garden. It really is common. It can become a bit of a dominating species if areas are undergrazed, and it can take over where maybe there's some nicer vegetation. So it's a nice one to get your eye in, but it's not necessarily a great sign if you've got a habitat dominated by it sometimes. So that's neutral grasslands pretty much covered in terms of the three likely species of each of those groups you're going to find. So now if we look at another type of potentially grassland or habitat entirely, which is acid grassland, heathland and upland. So there's lots of quite distinctive species that you could get on these that are not necessarily going to find in other habitats. And again, I'm just going to go through the ones that I'm not going to go in on detail about. So I'm going to talk about wavy hairgrass in a minute. So this is called bristlebent. Now, this isn't a really common species, particularly common down, more located down in sort of the southwest, Dorset, its particular stronghold. It's got that lovely big sort of tuft where it comes out, and it's slightly bluish, greenish, grey or glaucous, which is something we'll go into in more detail about that term. But that one could be quite indicative of having a sort of acidic habitat. Another one is common bent, which you can get in all habitats as well. But that one's one of the sort of fine grasses that creates a lovely sort of mist effect later on in the season. Mat grass, which is sort of quite an upland specialist or heathland specialist. It's kind of got this classic, I'm trying to think of a way to describe it, but it's sort of all one-sided sort of spike there and forms these big mats of grass, hence the name. I'm going to talk about oval sedge in a bit. So this is common yellow sedge. That one can be quite common in upland or acidic habitats. Again, I'm just showing you some examples, but we're going to go into detail on some of the other ones. This is heath rush, which you can get all over sort of mountain, moorland, sort of heathland habitats. It's quite a chunky one with the sort of big chunky top parts and flowers to it. So it can be quite distinctive if you come across that. And then we're going to go into compact rush in a bit. So this is heath wood rush. So remember we talked about the wood rushes. So this has the long white hairs on the leaves. But unlike fieldwood rush, the heathwood rush has quite a compact flowering head here, and it's often found in those sort of heathland or acidic habitats. So the first one that we're going to talk about is wavy hairgrass. So this is the grass species of this particular habitat we're going to talk about. And this one is really distinctive because of its sort of wavy pedicels. Pedicel is the name of the stalk that comes along here that bears the spikelets at the end. And some of them, when you look at it, it actually looks like it's gone through the 1980s and been crimped, like one of those hair crimpers. So it gives this sort of zigzaggy look to it. It's a really tufted species, so it tends to grow in this sort of tuft like that, and then sends all of its stems or culms up with the inflorescence poking above the top. Quite often you can see it growing in amongst heather, sort of the grass poking up through the top of the heather. And it's a good indicator that perhaps you're in a sort of acid grassland. It's called Avenella flexuosa, but it was recently changed from Deschampsia. So a lot of people would still be referring to it as Deschampsia, but it did change recently. It's a beautiful grass. Sometimes it could be mistaken for one of the bent grasses, the agrostis, but it actually has 2 florets per spikelet rather than the one. So remember we were talking about the individual flowers part of the spikelet. This one has 2 individual flowers in that little lump there called the spikelet, whereas the bent grasses, the agrostis, have just the one. So this one could be a really useful one to get to know. So then moving on to talking about the sedge that could be characteristic of this habitat type that you're likely to see. And this is oval sedge, Carex leporina. It was ovalis. By the way, I apologize for any of the way that I say any Latin. It's not like anyone's telling us exactly how it's meant to be said, and I did not do very well at Latin at school. I think that ovalis was nice and easy to remember, but obviously they've changed it, so there you go. That's not my decision. But basically, oval sedge, it's there to describe the fact that the fruits or the nutlets are slightly ovoid in shape, but also the spikelets themselves, I would say from a distance, look quite ovoid or oval-like. The inflorescence, so that's the whole part of the flowers, is really rather weighty. It's quite sort of substantial. And so actually it can be quite distinctive to look at from a distance. And this is one of the species where there aren't obvious separate male and female parts to it. So all of the spikelet parts look the same. It tends to favour acidic soils, so acid grassland, heathland, but I have also found it in churchyards, for example. Not that churchyards are necessarily not acidic, you can get acidic grassland in churchyards, but it could maybe be found on more neutral soils as well. The stems tend to sort of grow out from the base in like a really curved way or at an angle. Although this could be quite hard to see when it's in sort of long vegetation like this, but if you were seeing it in like the churchyard with shorter vegetation, you would see that the way that it grows is quite distinctive. It's very difficult to get good photographs of these species. I know that myself, I try and take photos when I'm out of certain species. But grasses and sedges, it doesn't seem to matter how you try and take the photo. It ends up just looking like this big green mess of stuff, even though when you're looking at it, it looks quite distinctive. So you have to bear with me on some of the photo options that I've had to go with. It's just that's all I've got access to, but it still gives you the vague idea that you can see these sort of slightly darker lumpy bits in the grassland, and that's quite distinctive of oval sedge. So then we'll look at the rush species for this habitat, and I mentioned that we were going to go through compact rush, because I would say it's another really, really common and sometimes dominating rush as well, similar to soft rush. However, there are some subtle differences that are worth looking at, and that can help you decide which one you have. For example, the flowers, they don't really open out more than this. Unlike soft rush, we saw can start like this and then spread out. I would say it always looks a bit more like this, compact. However, a young soft rush could start off looking like this, and you might think that that's what it is, or the other way around, you might think that you've got compact when actually it's a young soft rush. But I've just got one more photo that I think quite shows it. I like to think that they look a bit like little hedgehogs clinging onto I don't know, a fence post or something. They're just quite compact, and that's quite distinctive of it. But there are other ways to be able to tell that you've got compact rush and not just like a young soft rush or something. And that's because the stems are faintly ridged. Now, when I say faintly ridged, it means that you can't necessarily always see it that easily, and different species are easier to see than others. But you can see from this cross-section photo here that there are some distinct ridges that are obvious there. And basically, the only way to really be sure that you've got those ridges is to just gently roll the stem or the leaf in your hand, and you can just about feel those. The other thing is that because they've got these ridges, the stem is nowhere near as glossy and shiny as soft rushes, and it just gives it a sort of generally duller look to it than soft rush does. But the other thing is compact rush tends to like quite acidic habitat, so it'll tend to be the one you're more likely to find if you know you're in heathland or bog habitats or that sort of thing. So it's worth remembering that. So we'll move on to a different habitat that you might be coming across next, and that's calcareous grassland. Remember I mentioned it at the beginning. It's a wonderful habitat, quite species rich, unfortunately hugely declining because of the fact that it's quite sensitive to being undermanaged or overmanaged or whatever. So again, I'm going to go through the species that we're not going to talk about now just briefly, and then I'll focus on the 3 from the groups that we're going to look at. So I'm going to talk about upright brome in a second, but another one that you could find up on some nice calcareous grassland is probably one of my favorite grasses, which is quaking grass. And it has these really rather gorgeous, like little rattle heads on it. And it blows in the wind and it's just absolutely gorgeous. Can grow on neutral grasslands as well. It's not necessarily indicative of calcareous, but it's one that you could find while you're there. Another species of calcareous grassland that's a grass is tallgrass, which it's a kind of a bit like, if anyone knows, wood false brome, which we're going to come on to when we talk about woodland. But it's just quite distinctive grass of that kind of habitat if you come across it. Sheep's fescue is a kind of a bit of a random one, but that one can quite often occur in calcareous grassland, but equally it can occur in acidic grassland too. It's very much difficult one to identify between the other one it looks like, which is red fescue, but there are some little ways that you can tell how it's sheathing in the young plant, but you have to look really carefully. But generally, overall, the look of it can tell you that it's sheep's fescue, not red fescue, mainly because the inflorescence doesn't really open out much more than that. We're going to talk about glaucous sedge. So this is spiked sedge. You can see where it's got its name because it really does look almost like a sort of medieval mace. And that one's a really common one that you could find growing in this sort of habitat. And then another one, which is probably one of my favorite sedges, which is flea sedge. So named because it's meant to look a bit like some fleas clinging onto a grass stem or something. A bit gross, really, when you think about it like that. This one can quite often be found in calcareous habitats, but probably on the wetter side, maybe a sort of base-rich flush or something. Equally, could be in a calcareous part of a sort of acidic habitat overall. And then, the other ones we're going to talk about are hard rush and fieldwood rush I mentioned before. So you could also find that in calcareous grassland. I thought it might be worth just for a second pausing and talking about this. We throw around these terms sometimes, calcareous grassland, acid grassland. How do we know what it is? How do we know we're standing in it? And I can promise you this, I'm not standing there with some coring device, getting a sample of soil and getting my pH monitor out. I'm sure that's how geologists and things do it, and that's great for them. But I'm making that judgment based on lots of things, which is, first of all, where am I in the country and where am I in my surrounding habitat? So if I'm somewhere like up on the Downs or Salisbury Plain or, sort of the chalk downlands, then I know that I'm probably more likely to come across calcareous. Equally, I live near the Quantocks. So if I'm up in the Quantocks where there's heathland and everything, then probably it's going to be slightly more on the acidic side. It's then looking at the surrounding vegetation. So if I am up on the Quantocks and there's, a nice big open bit of grassland and one side I've got gorse bushes and heather and all sorts of things like that, then I'm probably going to be somewhere slightly more acidic. Similarly, if I'm up in the chalk hills and the paths are all chalky and not sandy, then that's going to give me an indication. The other thing are the type of species that are growing with all of these other things. If you can start to identify some of those, they will give you clues. If I'm on an acidic bit of grassland, then I might expect to see tormental, bit of heath bedstraw, that sort of thing. If I'm in calcareous, then, there'll be certain species that I might more likely to see. And the books are actually really helpful for that, in that their description of each of the species will often say that it likes acidic grasslands, or it likes calcareous habitats, or avoids lime, which means it doesn't like calcareous habitats. And that I would use those things definitely as a guide for learning how to recognize what kind of habitat you're in. So just a quick aside on that one. So I said we were going to talk about a grass from this calcareous habitat, and I could not do upright brome, just because it is such a classic species for this habitat. It's not like a generalist, as I was talking before. It's a bit more of a specialist, so you really do only get it in sort of calcareous sites pretty much. However, it can actually dominate some of these habitats if it's left unmanaged. From a distance, you see this picture and you're like, could look like any old grass, really, couldn't it? However, it does have a few distinctive features which could help us along the way of knowing that that's what it is. For example, it's really, really upright. So no surprises how it got its name. And the meaning for this is that the stems themselves, the culm, is so stiff, and it can support that rather bulky inflorescence and keep it very upright, whereas other species might be more likely to be nodding with that sort of weight on the top. So when you look across at the grassland, all those big chunky inflorescences are very much upright, and it's only a big gust that's going to nod them over. There are also some really long spreading hairs which come out from the base of the leaf and the leaf sheath. And they can be really, really distinctive, and sort of coming out and all over the place in sort of random way that they're there. However, with all these things, those hairs could rub off as the season progresses. So it might be worth, if you are looking around and trying to decide, finding the youngest or freshest specimen properly as possible. However, as I was talking about knowing whether you're in calcareous or acidic, the best way to tell that you probably have this grass is to know that if you're in that habitat type, and then maybe use a picture reference just to double check and read your books. But if you're on good chalky calcareous grass and you've got a grass that looks like this, then it's likely going to be upright brome, just because it's so typical of that habitat. So let's talk about a sedge in this kind of habitat. And this is a sedge that actually you'll get in all sorts of habitats, called glaucous sedge, Carex flacca. So this one can be found in loads of habitats, not just calcareous. So I've used the term glaucous a couple of times before, and obviously this one is called glaucous sedge. So in case you're not familiar with that terminology, it's simply a description of the colour that is somewhere between green, grey and blue. And it's more sort of a dull turquoisey green than a green, if that makes sense. So this species has that colour on the underneath of the leaf, so on the underside, whereas the top side of the leaf is kind of a normal green, if you will, a bright green. But because obviously you're not only looking at this species always just from above, you're looking at it from a distance, the glaucous appearance of the whole plant, could be seen because the leaves are all slightly on one side. So it can look quite glaucous from a distance. This is one of the species that actually has that distinctive different male and female spikes. So you can see here we've got this long cylindrical bits here, and generally there are 2 to 3 male spikes on it, which can be hard to tell exactly how many there are because they kind of often get stuck together or lie together. And then normally 1 to 5 of these female spikes, which I like to describe the female spikes on all of these sedge type species. They look a bit like either mini corn on the cob or sort of a long thin pine cone when they're all sort of swollen with their fruits. But this is sort of another classic look of sedges with that different male bit at the top. But again, counting how many of those male spikes to female spikes can be useful in the description as to what species you have. You can see here in the picture that you've got that glaucous underside, but the slightly more normal green on the top there. And there's another species that looks incredibly similar, but there's a real distinct difference which you can tell. So now we'll look at one of the rushes for this habitat type. So this is probably in one of the top 3 common most rushes, along with the soft rush and the compact rush. However, thankfully, it looks really different from those two. Again, it can be found in multitude of habitats, so not necessarily indicative of calcareous. But this one is another one that's described as being glaucous, with all of the leaves and the stems sort of being that color. Now, this one is another one that has this sort of ribbed or ridged stem, but they're much more obvious on this than the compact rush. And the inflorescence, although could be described as similar initially to the soft rush, it gets even more spread out with these much longer pedicels. And it sort of almost holds itself upright as well. So it doesn't sort of, it's not as bulky with its flowers. And the stems are actually quite hard. And, you know, we were talking about soft rush and how you can squash it quite easily, whereas you can't do that with hard rush. And I suppose that's where it's got its name from, isn't it? But this one, again, it's that glaucous look to it that's quite distinctive about this one. And it's often growing alongside a soft rush as well. So you can get them both together, which is quite useful because then you can tell them apart. And here on this cross section, you can see how obvious those ridges are. Right, so another habitat type. Now, everyone will have to forgive me because I did the majority of my botany for 15 years in Warwickshire. Now, Warwickshire isn't known for its extensive coastlines. So actually, my knowledge of coastal botany has definitely been something of a journey of late. So you'll have to forgive me if anything I say about some of the coastal species is coming more from my understanding of reading about it rather than direct contact. Although I have seen most of these species, but yeah. So this one, thankfully, everyone should be fairly familiar with as a common grass of the coastline, the marram grass, which is that one that's poking up in our dunes everywhere. You sit down for your nice picnic on the beach and you get spiked up the bottom by this rather spiky grass called marram. So that one, most people are probably very familiar with. We're going to talk about sea cooch as the example one, so I won't show you a picture of that now. This is another really bizarre grass called common cordgrass, which grows in sort of salt marshy type habitats. And it's got these really unusual long spikelets of grasses that are almost branch spikelets. It's quite unusual and quite distinctive and very tall, sharp, grassy leaves coming up here. We're going to talk about sand sedge. So this is sea club rush. Again, a really common one that you might see growing around sort of salt marshes or estuaries and that sort of thing. And that being a club rush, it's very, very tall and can dominate whole patches. And it has these quite distinctive branched heads. And then another species that is very common is called distant sedge. Obviously, that's going to be much smaller than the club rush, but that's one that you could see on the coasts as well. And then we have the, we're going to talk about the salt marsh rush. So this is sea rush. So that's another one that you could find. The good thing about coastal habitats is that quite often, you know, the species are quite distinctive and they will only grow in coastal habitats. So actually it narrows down your pool of things to look for quite dramatically. So the first one we're going to talk about is the grass species of this habitat. And this one is sea cooch. Now, many of you might have heard of cooch grass, mainly because people are moaning what a pain it is, because it can be a bit of an annoying weed, especially in gardens. But did you actually know that there are quite a few different types of cooch grasses? They're all part of like the same sort of genus or two genuses, but there's common cooch, sea cooch, sand cooch, and even bearded cooch. But sea cooch is actually, funnily enough, found by the sea. So this picture here is where I found it growing at this really lovely salt marsh place on the south coast. But it can also be found on shingle banks, sea walls, the edges of brackish creeks, or even on the sort of turf of the cliff top that gets sort of lots of sea spray. From the first meeting with it, you could be mistaken for thinking that it is common cooch because it's quite similar. However, there are a few things other than its primary location for giving away that it's not common cooch. And that's, again, we're going back to that terminology of the fact that it's quite glaucous. So it's more a bluish green than that of common cooch. But also have a look at this fringing. Now it's like being at a line dance club here with the fringing going on. This is the leaf sheath, and it has this classic bit of fringing here that I've just used a hand lens to look at. but that is a hugely distinctive feature about this grass. So if you've ever got something that you think could be sea couch, have a look at those edges of the leaf sheath here, and if it's got some fringing, you know what you've got. So then if we look at a sedge for this habitat, we have sand sedge, really, really common. And as you can imagine, it likes to grow in sandy places. So dunes and beaches, for example, and it is generally a common species around the UK coast. It has sort of two elements of its appearance and growth habit that make it quite distinctive. Firstly, the inflorescences are quite bulky and large compared to the size of the sedge as a whole. If you look at that, it's quite weighty, whereas this is quite small. It almost looks slightly out of sync with each other. But also the other thing is it has these long creeping rhizomes under the sand that pop up new plants all the way along. So for those who aren't familiar with the term rhizome, it's basically like an adapted stem that grows underground, sending up genetically identical plants as it goes along. Stolons are the ones that grow overground. So it's the rhizomes that happen underground where you can't see. And it basically just shoots up new plants at regular intervals. And you can almost see it in this picture here, popping up the other species, sort of the other plants popping up as it goes along. And apparently that's very, very common and kind of gives it that look about it. And it can be growing in sand, but also maybe in sandy shingle or something like that. So that's one to look out for if you're in that habitat. And then if we look at our rush specimen for this habitat, then we've got the salt marsh rush. Again, helpfully, they've all got the sort of sea sand thing in the title, which is quite helpful. This can form basically extensive patches because instead of being tufted as its growth form, it's probably creeping and it creates big stands of this vegetation. It can be found sort of up the upper level of salt marshes, wet brackish grassland, and again, cliff top turf as well that gets the sea spray. It can basically, the inflorescence is this kind of loose and spreading with these dark brown sort of nutty fruit type egg-shaped bits. And basically it is described as being egg-shaped, which can be similar to another species called round-fruited rush. But again, its location in these sort of salt marsh habitats would be what gives it away. One of the other things that's talked about as being distinctive is that this bract, which is this sort of bit that's like a stem-like feature, is supposed to be shorter than the inflorescence, which in these photos you can see it generally does. But in this one that's been picked, it doesn't quite seem to fit that description. And when you look up the description for this plant across the board, it's generally always referred to as usually being shorter. And if it says it like that, it's because basically they don't always fit into that description. So with this one, I would say the fact that it forms extensive stands of it and it's growing in a salt marsh habitat and it's got these large egg-shaped nutlets, then you're pretty sure that you're going to have salt marsh rush. So another habitat this time, one that most people are probably quite familiar with, woodland. It could be your local forest, or it's the woods down the road, or even a little spinney or a copse. We've got lots of different ways of, or different habitats of woodland. Now, woodland's quite good again because quite a lot of the species have the name wood in the name, which makes it quite easy to tell. And I'll just go through quickly some of the ones that you're not going to see, that I'm not going to go into full detail on. So something called wood false brome, which grows again in distinctive tufts. One thing I've noticed actually, and it's probably something to do with the ecology of woodlands, but most of the grass and sedge and rush species tend to form little tussocks or tufts of vegetation. This one is a really common one. It's a bright yellow, sort of yellowy green, often grows on road verges as well, or anywhere there's a bit of shade on the edge of a meadow. And it's quite densely hairy as you go from the end of the leaves down into the stem part. That's a really common one. Wood millet, so called because it looks a bit like a kind of crop millety type style, big panicle inflorescence, and then these sort of little rounded spikelets give it this quite distinctive look to it. A lovely grass to find in the woodland. Another one that could be similar but actually has much more delicate and less sort of round little spikelets is the tufted hairgrass. This again, very common in woodland, especially where it's slightly damper and you get these little tussocks of it. When it's not flowering, it's quite dark green leaves, so it can look quite distinctive when it's growing in a little tuft. Pendulous sedge. Now, a lot of people might be familiar with this one, partly because it seems to just do well everywhere. It is a woodland species, but I have it growing as a weed everywhere in my garden, and it seeds absolutely everywhere. So everyone might be familiar with this one. Massive sedge. I mean, it really is humongous. It can get very big, a couple of meters, sort of tall, a meter wide. And it has these these are the female spikes that are very much drooping, like it's describing, it's pendulous, and it has the male ones at the top, but very, very distinctive. This one is remote sedge, and I really struggled to find a better picture of this one. But I would say the best way to describe remote sedge is that it actually doesn't look like a sedge. It looks like a grass, a little tuft of a grass, but because it's so thin-leaved. But again, to be sure, you would simply just maybe snip a bit off and feel that it's got 3 sides and it is a triangular cross section, and then you know you've got a sedge. But it has these sort of small clusters of the spikelets that are in the sort of axes here, and it's very delicate, but very, very common in woods. And then this is one called great wood rush. So we mentioned the wood rushes. Again, they've got, you can't quite see it in this photo, but again, they would have these long white hairs along these flat green leaves. You can just about see there's a bit of white hair here. And then it has these sort of clusters of inflorescence at the top. We're going to look at hairy wood rush in a minute, which is very similar, but looks like a slightly smaller version. And then finally, bulbous rush, which again, it's got these quite distinctive sort of clumping of flowers in amongst it. But again, it's going to have round stems and not the triangular ones because it's not a sedge. So the first species, we're going to look at a grass, and it's probably one of my absolute favorite woodland grasses, which is wood melic. It's absolutely beautiful. It's really distinctive kind of all year round, really. So from when it's first growing to sort of when it's finished, because the glooms still stay on and it just looks beautiful. So once you've got your eye in on this one, actually, you know, it'll be okay to find it. The leaves are sort of a bright green and really very soft, and the sheaths are sort of sparsely hairy, and so are the lower parts of the leaves. And the spikelets form a very loose inflorescence that are very large in comparison to the pedicels or stalks. So these spikelets are quite large, giving quite a distinctive look. The other thing about them is they've got this bristle-like appendage on the leaf sheath here, which is quite distinctive of it. I've tried to do an illustration of it as well, just to show up what I'm actually talking about. And it has all these sort of hairy bits as well. Really beautiful one to get to know. Wood sedge is basically like a mini version of pendulous sedge. So it's very similar in terms of its leaf shape and everything, but I would say that it's much smaller than pendulous sedge, but also the inflorescences have slightly longer pedicels as well. It's very yellowy green in colour, and again, it's got the sort of 1 male spike and then the 3 to sort of 5 female spikes underneath. So basically, wood sedge is a mini version of pendulous sedge, is the best way to remember it. It often grows on wood pathways or in sort of woodland rides along the edge, sort of dotted about. So it could be quite an easy one to get your eye in. And I mentioned we were going to talk about hairy wood rush, one of the wood rushes with the lovely hair. I mean, you can see on this picture quite happily just shows you just how much white and hairy they are. And this is it growing in its classic sort of tufty way that it likes to grow. But it doesn't have that quite so big and robust as the great wood rush. It's much more spread out and more delicate, but they stay on all year round, which is really good because then you can kind of see what it is all year round. Just slightly aware of time. So the final habitat to quickly run through is bog and wet heath. So that's your bogs, your moors, your swamp, blanket bog, raised bog, all of that kind of thing. Very distinctive habitat and not particularly species rich, really. So it's kind of difficult to find examples of all of them. We're going to talk about wavy hair grass. We talked about wavy hair grass, and we're going to talk about purple moor grass. But this is cotton grass, which sounds like it should be a grass, but it's actually a sedge. but everyone's pretty familiar with cotton grasses. They're two different species really, or a few different species, but generally cotton grass is fine for recognizing that. We're going to talk about carnation sedge, but star sedge, a classic one of this habitat. As you can see, it forms these little stars, which is quite pretty. And then sharp flowered rush, which is kind of just a classic round rush with your bits at the top, and the flowers are supposed to be fairly pointy, and we've talked about compact rush already. So let's talk about purple moorgrass. It's an incredibly common grass for any sort of acidic habitat, particularly heathland, wet heath, bogs, mires, etc. It forms these large tussocks that could actually easily trip you over. If you're going through really tussocky grassland, this is the one that trips you over your wellies. And actually it forms kind of tussocks in the bogs that you can carefully use as stepping stones if anyone's done that and accidentally missed one and then ended up in the bog. It's generally rather a glaucous green, again, that colour, that word again, rather than a fresh green. And the leaves can slightly inroll and kind of really directly straight up. So it actually looks quite spiky from a distance. The inflorescence is this sort of compact panicle of purplish spikelets. But this is another one that has that classic ring of hairs instead of a ligule. So you can see zoomed in here, we don't have this papery thin membranous ligule, we have this ring of hairs. And that is a really good way of double checking that's what species you have. So the sedge for this habitat is carnation sedge. Now I remember we talked about glaucous sedge being quite similar to this one, but the difference is here that it has the glaucous colour on the underneath and the top side. So you'd have that glaucous colour on both sides of the leaf. The other thing about the leaf is that you're going to have that mid-rib vein, and it will go up to a certain point and then it won't, it will stop, and then the tip of the leaf will actually be solid and it won't have that extra bit going down the middle. Whereas on glaucous sedge, you'd have that mid-rib vein going all the way to the very tip. So that's, you can run your finger down it and you can actually feel the solid leaf tip of this species. So that's quite useful. Otherwise, it has that general look of the other sedges with the separate male spike and the separate female spikelet bits as well. So, but it's the leaves that are going to tell you what it is more than anything, but also the fact that it loves acidic wet habitats as well. And lastly, the rush for this habitat. I've gone with jointed rush, but again, doesn't necessarily have to be in one of these habitats. You can get this in a lot of other wetland habitats as well. But this one is the classic one that I was talking about with the interrupted pith in the middle. So you can see if you were to cut open a section of it, it's going to have these marked points in it that basically before you cut it open, if you were to run your finger all along it, you'd feel like you were going over those speed bumps at the roundabout, because it has those little marks, you can feel them in it. There are a couple of others with that, but this one is very common. It slightly grows at an angle from its base, so it doesn't sort of grow straight up, it sort of curves and comes out. That's another thing, that, particularly if it's growing on sort of bare mud and everything, you can see that. Generally, the leaves have got sort of an oval cross section and are slightly flattened. And again, then it's quite a spread out sort of inflorescence at the top. Right, so now I've got one little quiz just to check you've all been listening. I'm just going to launch the poll now. So hopefully everyone can see that. And I've just got 6 questions, completely anonymous. So I do not know who's answering what, but have a look at the questions. The first one is asking you, what shape is the cross section of a sedge? Is it square? Is it oval? Or is it triangle? So just click on the answer that you think that is. Then what is the shape or the cross section of most rushes? Again, is it round or circle? Is it triangle or is it square? And then what does glaucous mean? That lovely word that I've been throwing in there all the way through. Is it bright fresh green, blue grey green, or does it mean it's hairy? And then we're looking at this habitat here. What assemblage of sedges, grasses and rushes might we find in this habitat here with all these trees? So I've written down, we've got quaking grass, glaucous sedge and heath rush, or wood sedge, wood melic and hairy wood rush, or sand sedge, salt marsh rush and sea couch. And then what about this habitat here with the lovely heather and the gorse? What do you think we might find there? Sand sedge, salt marsh rush and sea cooch, wood sedge, wood melick and hairy wood rush, or wavy hairgrass, oval sedge and compact rush? And then finally, what about some neutral grassland? Wavy hairgrass, oval sedge and compact rush, Yorkshire fog, hairy sedge and soft rush, or wood sedge, wood melick and hairy wood rush? So everyone is thick and fast answering. Well done, everyone that's done that. That is excellent. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to end the poll and share the results, and then we can go through them. So what shape is the cross section of a sedge? Yep, 100% it is triangular shaped. Well done. Sedges have edges. What is the shape or the cross section of most rushes? Yes, round or circle. Rushes are round. What does glaucous mean? Is it bright fresh green? No, it's blue grayish green, or however you may interpret it, but yes, that's right. What sedges or grasses might you find in this habitat? And yep, wood sedge, wood melick and hairy wood rush would be classic. Unlikely to get quaking grass in it. That's more of a grassland one. I mean, you know, with all these things, there's always one that breaks the rules, and unlikely to get your salt marsh rush unless this is actually a bit of woodland right on the edge of salt marsh. What about this habitat here? That's heathland. Yep, right, wavy hairgrass, oval sedge and compact rush. Brilliant. If you put wood sedge, wood melick and hairy wood rush, yeah, you could get those things in there too if there's a bit of woodland nearby. I was just going for the obvious ones there. What about in the neutral grassland? Yeah, Yorkshire fog, hairy sedge and soft rush. Brilliant, absolutely right. So everyone did really, really well. So that was just to check you're all awake, and we're coming to the end now. So just to sort of finally wrap up really. So generally the rules that we've been learning can be applied across all of those three groups. So whether you have a grass, a sedge or a rush. So grasses, generally round and hollow stems with the sections or the nodes and the leaves in two alternate ranks. And we've got that variability in those inflorescences that are really quite spectacular. The sedges, yes, we've got the three-sided triangular cross-section stems. The leaves arranged spirally in three ranks. And again, they do have ligules and leaf sheaths and things, but generally, if you've got a triangular stem, then you've got a sedge. And then rushes, they're rounded with sort of solid, continuous or either interrupted sort of solid pithy stems, and their stems are quite leaf-like and they're generally sort of almost evergreen in appearance. So hopefully that has helped, but what to do next? Well, obviously it's October, there's not a lot out there, but there are some things out there that are leafy or green, so it's time for you to go out and have a look for some of these things. If not, re-watch this at the right time next year and then go out there and look for all these different species and see what you can find. But for now, I'm just going to see if we've got any questions. Right, let's have a look. Felicity, I might need you just to help me pick out some questions that are appropriate. Otherwise, I'm going to be scrolling through the chat. But so what are the common rushes and sedges on bog and wet heath, please? Ah, right. Well, if it's so without just spending time thinking about it, I'll just go back to my slide for the sake of it. Bog and wet heath. So essentially you're going to have purple moorgrass as probably one of your main sort of grass species. Wavy hairgrass is really common. You've got your cotton grasses, which are sedges, a little bit confusing that one. Carnation sedge, star sedge, sharp flowered rush and compact rush. Again, there are a multitude of other species, but those are the ones that you're quite likely to find. Lost my mouse there.
I think that's it for questions, Sarah. And
yeah,
I'm
no worries.
aware that we're
sorry, yeah, I went over a little bit.
We're on time, aren't we? I would like to say thank you very much. As somebody who doesn't know anything about grasses, rushes and sedges, I kind of feel now that I can go out and I can at least start to distinguish between those three groups. And also, I was absolutely fascinated by the little nutlets. Was it on the And also the really hairy wood sedges. I've never even sort of realised that those wood rushes, sorry, that those were something. There I am mixing everybody up. Never realised those were different. So thank you so much for that. We're going to be back in spring, aren't we? Doing more on grasses, sedges, and rushes, and hopefully have more sessions. So if anyone's enjoyed that, join us again in the spring. But thank you, Sarah.
No worries. Thank you so much. I'm glad that you've all enjoyed it, and get out there and start looking at all of those sedges, rushes and grasses, and hopefully know the difference. Thank you for helping. Thank you for watching. All right. Bye.